I'm at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, and I've been there for 20 years now, which is crazy. It's who would have thought I'd be at one place for so long? But it's been a place where I've had opportunities to reinvent myself over time, and where I'm an academic, but we are about creating change towards sustainable futures. That's our mission, and we're very focused on the ground action research. So we're very much about doing rather than just researching. And so I'm going to talk about futures thinking, and Luke started us off on that, which is great. And I'm going to talk a little bit about storytelling and narrative along the way, because I think great futures thinking is often great storytelling. They're very much aligned because we don't have any other way to talk about the future other than tell stories. We don't have data about it. It comes down to how compelling our stories are. So we all have this innate capacity to think about the future. It's a human quality that all of us have. We plan, even if it's just planning ahead in your day. It could be planning your career. It's at a more sort of civilizational level. It's about being able to plan our agricultural system and to look ahead and save seeds and all that kind of thing. So it's this ability to think ahead, to apply foresight, is an innate human capacity. So we all have this ability to be futures thinkers. And at the same time, we're all born storytellers. Story is how we make sense of the complex world around us and boil it down into something that makes some sort of sense to us. In a book called Wired for Story, Lisa Cron wrote that story is what enabled us to imagine what might happen in the future and so prepare for it, a feat no other species can lay claim to. Story is what makes us human, not just metaphorically, but literally. We think in story. It's hardwired in our brain. It's how we make strategic sense of the otherwise overwhelming world around us. So we're all storytellers. We're all futures thinkers. And when we're talking about the past, when we're talking about history, we can tell stories about history, and they are still stories. We're still reconstructing what happened. But we can draw on evidence to make those stories convincing. We can look at documents and photographs and video records and accounts. And scientists can create evidence about what happened, and that's what the scientific method is about. But when we come to the future, where it's conjecture, we don't have data, we haven't been there. So we're relying entirely on the quality of the story to convince us. And when Luke put up the futures cone before, telling stories about what's a probable future, what's plausible, what's preferable, some of what people perceive as where it might sit in that futures cone depends on how well the story is told. How convincing a case can you put together for a particular future being the one that comes about? And this isn't just an interesting thing or an entertaining thing. It's actually really important because stories shape the future. They're not just about the future, they actually create the future. So we're constantly in political contestation between different stories about what the future is. Stories bring the future into being. They create the reality that lies ahead of us. So the quality of our stories and the power that's behind them is incredibly important for what kind of futures we actually get. So what kind of stories do we typically tell about the future? There's some work in futures thinking that looks at all the kind of stories that we tell, the scenarios that we create about the future, the visions that emerge, and finds that very often they fall into one of four categories. The what we might think of as scenario archetypes or archetypal futures. So the first story we tell about the future is very much the one that's, I guess, in the middle of that cone that Luke put up. It's when you project trends forward and you look at what people see as business as usual. It's this idea of a techno-utopia. And I've given the images from the Marvel movies, and it's the city of Wakanda. But it's an idea that we, through continual economic growth and progress and technological development, will have this bright future ahead of us where everything looks grand. So that's the goal of all this economic growth that we're always talking about. And of course, I probably don't need to tell people on this call that there's a dark side to that story, that that particular vision of the future sweeps a lot of problems under the carpet. the destruction that it's causing of nature, the social injustice and inequity that it delivers. And it's a story of separation where, that's to use a term that Charles Eisenstein coined. He's got a great book about climate, The New Story. But it's a story where we're separate from each other in nature, and we live in a mechanical world that we have dominance over and therefore are free to exploit. And then competition, free markets and growth in GDP are going to deliver us well-being. And of course, there's lots and lots of problems with this. It's delivered the kind of ecological destruction and social misery that we have seen. And if you take that further into how that might develop, then you get the second very common kind of story, which is the dystopian story. And this is perhaps the most common one in popular culture these days, whether it's, I could have put up any number of examples here. This one's Blade Runner 2049, the sequel to the original Blade Runner. I could have chosen things from gaming, from TV, from books, but there's dystopian stories everywhere about what happens when we keep going down this path and we head into a future where either there's total collapse or it's a partial collapse where the rich live in walled-off fortresses and everybody else lives in misery outside. So this kind of future is everywhere. We see it it's capturing the fears that we have about the future. It's capturing the kind of situation that we're finding ourselves in now, where we're in lockdown. But the problem with this kind of story is that it's not particularly motivating. It creates fear. It may motivate some people to say, hey, let's try and avoid this kind of future. But for a lot of people, it says, oh, that feels really big, really scary. I don't think there's much I can do about that. I'm going to switch off and I'm going to do my own thing and I'm going to go shopping. So what we need is stories that actually create some positive sense of agency as well. So the third kind of story says, well, let's try and avoid that kind of future, and let's do it by a bit of discipline, by saying let's look for things like sufficiency. Let's try not to have so much growth. Let's move back to having local communities. And an example is the transition town movement or the transition movement, trying to move towards energy descent, not using as much of the earth's stuff. And often this kind of story can, it might not be all that palatable to a lot of people that are used to a future of growing prosperity and lots of consumption and so on. So there is a question about whether this kind of future is motivating for enough people to be a plausible story about the future. And whether a future where we go back to local communities and things like community gardening and organic gardening is scalable in a world that's heading towards a population of 8 billion. So can local food systems, for example, do enough to feed that kind of population? So there's some tensions in this kind of future. And then the fourth future, and I'm going to lock in behind this one as my preferred one, is a future called transformation, where we don't necessarily go back to relocalizing our communities. We continue to embrace technology, but we transform. We proactively lead and facilitate a transformation towards a world where we live within planetary boundaries, but also ensure that there's enough for everyone to live a good and decent life with good well-being. So there's probably some element of relocalization in this kind of future, but it's also a future that continues to embrace the global and a planetary perspective. So what's sometimes called a global approach. So it could be a beautiful future with cities that look like this. And so what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time is how do we pursue that kind of transformation and the kind of systems change that's needed to get there. So some of the work that I've been doing is about looking at alternative narratives about what a transformed world might look like. And a transformation that takes us beyond the narratives of neoliberal capitalism, for example, to look at a new economy, to look at different approaches to global ethics. And if you look across that work, there's a surprising amount of common ground that emerges, even though there's an incredible diversity of approaches out there that are saying, hey, here's a possible new narrative that could get us out of the problem that we're in. And what you see is that they have similar ways of seeing the world, systems thinking, which Luke just talked about, and networks, the kind of ways that people are seeing the world in these new ways of thinking about the future. It's a regenerative relationship with nature where we're no longer extracting, but we're actually trying to heal, and we're trying to have a positive relationship with nature that helps to realize the potential that's in nature. It's a different kind of relationship with each other where we recognize our interdependence and our entanglement with each other, to use a quantum theory term. And we're seeing some of that kind of thinking in responses to the current COVID crisis, with people talking about how we're all in this together. And that's a really important reminder. We're not these atomized, rational, economic individuals that do everything by ourselves. We are entangled with each other, and we can't escape that, and would not want to. Common goals across these different narratives about the future: human well-being, social justice, and plurality. Nothing about GDP growth in there, you'll see. And while there's huge diversity of how people think we should get there, what I've called enablers here, there's a fair amount of agreement over the four that I've got down the bottom there: that we should have participation in our governance, that we need a new economic system, that there's going to be some sort of new human values that are needed to achieve this transformation, and that it's a transdisciplinary approach to knowledge and science that's needed, that moves beyond the old disciplinary boundaries and takes in other forms of knowledge. So what it might be called is a story of interbeing, to again draw on Charles Eisenstein's term, where we see each other as a community of living beings on a living earth. We are nature, we're not separate from nature, and we should be working to regenerate the earth. And we need to collaborate and cooperate to provide a safe and just future. So how on earth do we get there from where we are now? We need to transform entire systems. And so over the last 2.5 years, I've been working with a group that you can see here called the SDG Transformations Forum. And what we're trying to do is develop what we've called transformation systems. So this is a global network of practitioners and academics and activists that are trying to facilitate transformation towards flourishing futures. And what they're trying to do is build systems that could deliver transformation. And a lot of what that's about is connecting people up that are already doing great things, because right now a lot of people aren't connected into the networks that could make them much more powerful. But what we need to transform is essentially everything. All the things shown on here. There's transformations in nature, in our society and culture, what we believe, our institutions, our technologies, and that's going to require personal transformation as well. But when we started off the forum, we asked everyone involved, what do they see as the deep causes of our unsustainability? And the 6 on the right-hand side there are what emerged. That the capacity that individuals have to drive transformation, the way that we evaluate projects is not helping us to move towards transformation, financing systems, the way that our governance works, the way we innovate, and importantly for me, as this is the part that I'm leading, the narratives that drive us are not up to the task right now of transformation. So what we're trying to do is transform those narratives. And right now we've got a dominant, deep narrative of neoliberal capitalism that really contributes to the challenges we face. And we need to find a way to move beyond that with new stories and narratives and ideas. So the diagram shows the approach we're taking to that system transformation. That what we do is go out there and look for what are all the initiatives that are working in these different spaces. So I'm doing this for narratives, but others are doing it for financing and so on. And trying to connect those up so that they can be more powerful together and can actually connect up to be a system rather than a pile of different initiatives that aren't connected. And then we're doing experimentation, what we're calling radical action and learning. So we go out there and try things. We don't know how to transform these systems, so we have to try something, test it, evaluate it, see if it works, try it in a different place, and create networks, learning networks that can share that experience and hopefully get better at creating transformation from it. The reason that I'm particularly focused on narratives, and this ties back into futures thinking, is, as I said before, the power that those stories have over the kind of future that we get. So this is a quote from the novelist Erin Morgenstern from her book, The Night Circus, where she said, "You may tell a tale that takes up residence in someone's soul, becomes their blood and self and purpose. That tale will move them and drive them, and who knows what they might do because of it, because of your words." That's the power that stories have. And if we can get better stories circulating and start to connect up those stories and find common ground between them, then we might just be able to build a narrative that has the power to take on neoliberal capitalism. So how do we do that? Through practical examples of futures thinking. One is to warn people about the direction that we're going in. And Yuval Noah Harari, the writer who wrote books like Sapiens, has been doing a little bit of this recently, warning us about the future that could come after coronavirus if we're not careful. If we don't pay close attention to the increased surveillance that's being put in place, we run the risk of going down a path where that might become the new normal, and we might head off into a authoritarian kind of future where surveillance is just accepted. So we need to be careful, and futures thinking has a role in those kind of warnings, and that's what the dystopian futures I was talking about before do. They warn us not to go down particular paths. But more constructively, a project I was involved in last year was to try and come up with more positive stories about the future that aren't just utopian in the sense of unachievable, but that try to imagine achievable positive futures where we had transformed and responded to climate change. So I'd highly recommend the book. I should mention that I have a short story in there myself, so I'm plugging it on my own behalf as well. But it was a wonderful experience to try and write a story that moved away from the dystopian to imagine something more positive. And then there's work for particular cities and organisations. So in the early last year and the previous year, we worked for the City of Sydney on their Sustainable Sydney 2050 vision, and we developed a set of 4 scenarios about what the future of Sydney might look like. The network city, the circular city, people power, and energy abundance. And the difference between these scenarios, and we tried to blend positive and negative elements into each of them, a lot of it came down to who takes the leadership in the transformation that lies ahead of us. So in the network city, it was very much a technology and business-led future where new technologies and smart cities and so on led us to a more sustainable future, but with a bunch of problems that came with that it didn't do so much to include people. Circular city was much more focused on the circular economy. It was much more government-led, government incentives and so on to make circular economy clusters happen. And the problem with this was that they had to do that in this scenario by bringing in a personal carbon allowance and having quite stringent restrictions if you exceeded it. The people power scenario led by civil society in this case, so the transformation coming from the commons. This is my favourite, but we still had to put some things in there to make it a bit more negative as well. So there was, it was a little bit hard for some people to see how this kind of future could feasibly come about without sufficient support from government and business alongside it. And then the energy abundance future was imagining if solar power got so cheap that it was almost not worth metering. And so we suddenly had this huge amount of energy available to us that was renewable. And we thought that might be quite a positive thing, but when you thought it through, it might actually mean you had this future of overconsumption and hyperconsumption that led to problems in people's well-being. So this is the kind of thinking that can be useful in fleshing out the spaces in that futures cone that Luke talked about earlier, and then thinking through the pathways that might lie ahead. Not necessarily because these futures, none of these futures will come about, but the future may be some sort of mix of these different possibilities. And then the other thing I like to do do is much more about engaging people in creating their own futures, really sort of simple visioning processes where you get people to almost do a guided meditation of imagining themselves in the future. And after taking them through that process with their eyes closed for 5 minutes or so, you get them to draw what they saw and felt during the exercise. And then you can get people to pair up and talk about it, uh, share their visions, identify common memes or common ideas in them, and start to see what's the common ground across these different visions. I ran a couple of these last year, and the New Economy Network Australia has run one using that methodology as well. And we're starting to see, you can get some beautiful images coming out of it if people have some drawing talent, which I certainly don't. But we start to see common ground emerging from people's visions of the future. We see things like what's shown in the sticky notes here emerging, that people want healthy, regenerative nature. They want some hope and purpose. They want to see connectedness to place and to each other. They do want sufficiency, not more and more and more. They want space for creativity, and they want respect for everyone. So wrapping up with summarising a little bit of that, the role of futures thinking in systems transformation, I see 4 really important roles. One is warning and deconstruction and critique. So starting to tear down the old systems and their tired and stale stories. The second is visioning, imagination and creativity, starting to imagine new systems and what their stories might be. The third is really exploring and testing pathways. How can we get to that desirable future that we're imagining? And I've said there with the least loss of life, because these transformations, I've got to really stress that transformation, we often talk about it in this really positive way. And, you know, the image of transformation is the butterfly with its beautiful colours, but transformation can be messy and conflictual and violent. And we're in transformation at the moment with the virus. And I was in Chile last year when the protests happened there, and that was another kind of transformation. And so we want to try and find our way through this in the most positive and peaceful way possible. And then finally, futures thinking can engage people in the process of systems transformation, help them develop ownership of their own stories, crowdsource the future, and search for and build common ground. So thank you.
So people have been popping some questions in the chat channel. Would you mind now to have a little read through and select some of them to answer? Thanks.
Sure. What stories are you hearing now during this crisis that we can build on to create a transformative future? Thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, I'm very attuned to this. I've been doing a couple of projects recently that are about trying to draw out what are the elements of story that could take us through this transformation. And so I do keep noticing when those kind of elements are public discourse at the moment. And so the most one to me right now is the idea of our interrelatedness or interbeing with each other, our connectedness. So with the the slogan that's been a little bit, we're all in this together, it's this, this can be positive or negative, that we are very linked with other people. And so that link means we can catch the virus from them. But it also means that we'll have to, in solidarity, act to stay home, to do the right thing, to help out other people in the community. And it's a reminder that over time we've really run down the systems of the commons, the community, the government support systems that help us to maintain that connectedness to each other. And the economy sees us as individuals that are separated from each other and making our own decisions without taking each other into account. So one of the messages of this time for me is that we are all connected, and that's something that we really need to hold on to as we come out of this process and try and, we're building different kinds of commons now by connecting to different groups of people through so many people moving into these online spaces and engaging with people that they normally wouldn't. So potential, I think, to build on some of that as we come out of this crisis. And I mean, what who would have thought that people have been calling for a universal basic income as a new economic strategy for years and years. And then in the space of days, our government has, admittedly temporarily, but essentially provided that, which coming from a coalition government is just mind-boggling, and I would have thought would have been in the cone of preposterous in Luke's presentation previously. But can we build on something like that? If this kind of process helps us get through the crisis, can we point back to it and say, well, let's improve our safety nets for people in the future? Thanks, that was a great question. Tips for how to engage policymakers and politicians in futures thinking. That's a challenge I've found over the years. Been really difficult to get policymakers interested in futures thinking. There's been occasional processes we've been able to run. Some of the more progressive political constituencies have been open to this kind of thing. We've run workshops for the National Transport Commission in the past, and for often energy utilities and water utilities. But for a lot of decision makers, it seems, they're thinking about the next election cycle, they're thinking about the balance sheet and the financial year, and they're not sort of stepping up to think about what lies further ahead, even just 3 or 5 years ahead, let alone say 10 years ahead. So I wonder if there's an opportunity now, with how blindsided we've been by this crisis, to say, come on, we need a better foresight capacity. We need to be actually investing a little bit in thinking, what are the things that we might not be routinely thinking about, and how can we prepare for them? I hope that there's some opportunities in the current crisis to shift that kind of thinking. Certainly something I'm hoping to pursue. There's a good question there from Josh. We've had a few opportunities to move towards new value systems during pivotal moments in history. How do we overcome the systems in place that maintain the status quo? Are we saying that the alternative narrative at the time didn't resonate with enough people to tip the balance toward transformation? So one of the things we're really keen to do in the forum that I was talking about is look at some of the past transformations that have happened, and there have been multiple transformations in history where narratives have changed. And it's worth remembering that neoliberalism is only really got established in the 80s, coming out of earlier conversations post World War II in Mont Pelerin. But it's not. That was a transformation for neoliberal capitalism to come in, and that transformation came about because a group of thinkers associated with it were very strategic in trying to make sure that that narrative was taught in business schools and was influential in political circles. And they worked really, really hard to spread that narrative and to give it power. So to overcome it, we're going to need to work really, really hard to spread something that is equally powerful and compelling. And I don't think we've found what that is yet. And one of the problems with progressive movements is they're often very splintered, so that everyone's promoting slightly different ideas about what might be next, and forgetting that 80% of what they're talking about is common ground, and maybe it's trying to find more of that common ground so that we can create a more powerful meta-narrative that still creates space for huge diversity, but starts to talk about the things that we hold common, that could move beyond neoliberal capitalism. So there's questions about how much the narrative needs to resonate with how many people. There's some thinking out there that, once 5% of people are locked in behind a new narrative, that's enough to create a shift. And maybe that's true, but I'd like to think we can find something that's going to resonate with a lot more people than that. it's creating that more powerful story that is common ground for people, but also continuing to deconstruct the current narrative. And there's a lot of people out there now that feel that neoliberalism is teetering. It's in trouble. It was in trouble after the global financial crisis. It's in even more trouble now. It's not even delivering the growth that it promises in the West anymore. So there is an opportunity, and perhaps an opportunity coming out of the crisis that we're in now.